The Men Who Hated Christmas. This story begins just after Queen Victoria came to the throne. Jacob Marley had been dead for 7 years. His business partner, Ebenezer Scrooge, was the meanest man in London. He would not even pay for a coat of paint to remove Marley's name from the office sign. It still read, Scrooge and Marley. It was a cold, foggy Christmas Eve. Outside the office, a small boy was singing a carol. God rest you, merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay. Scrooge rushed out with a wooden ruler to take a crack at the boy's head. Just in time the boy scurried off. Scrooge hated Christmas and everything to do with it. He was a tight-fisted old miser who never did a kind deed nor gave a penny away. He looked as if the cold had got right inside him. His thin lips were blue, his eyebrows, wiry hair, and stubbly chin looked silver with frost. But coldest of all was Scrooge's heart. It made his office feel chilly, even in summer. At Christmas it was freezing. The fire was tiny, and Scrooge kept the coal bucket by his desk. His clerk couldn't fetch a piece of coal without asking. The clerk's name was Bob Cratchit. He sat on his high stool in the outer office, writing in a huge account book. Though he wore mittens, his fingers were so cold he could hardly hold his quill pen. He wore a long scarf, which he called his comforter, wrapped 3 times round his neck for warmth. His wife had knitted it, for Bob could not afford an overcoat. Scrooge only paid him 15 shillings a week. It was dark and foggy outside the office, but the people walking past were cheerful. The next day was Christmas, and the shops were blazing with lights and full of Christmas cheer. There were turkeys and geese, piles of oranges and apples, nuts, cakes and sweets, though not everyone had the money to buy them. Suddenly, Scrooge's office door opened and a cheery voice cried, "Merry Christmas, Uncle!" It was Scrooge's nephew, Fred. His face glowed with the cold, and his eyes sparkled. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug! What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." His nephew laughed. "What reason have you to be miserable? You're rich enough." "Merry Christmas," growled Scrooge. "Down with Christmas. If I had my way, every idiot that goes about saying Merry Christmas should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart." "You don't mean that, I'm sure, Uncle," said Fred. "Come and have Christmas dinner with us tomorrow, and let's be friends." But Scrooge refused. "I'm going to wish you a Merry Christmas in spite of your bad temper, Uncle," said Fred, "and a Happy New Year." "Bah!" Scrooge snapped as his nephew left. As Fred went out, he let in 2 gentlemen. They were collecting money for the poor, to give them a bit of comfort at Christmas time. Scrooge refused to give the money. He asked them, "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? I support those with my taxes. Let the poor go there." "Many can't go there," said one of the men, "and many would rather die." "Let them die then," said Scrooge. "There are far too many poor people." The gentleman went away, disappointed. The fog got deeper and the afternoon darker. Soon it was time to shut the office. Bob Cratchit got ready to leave. "I suppose you want the day off tomorrow," Scrooge grumbled. "If it's convenient, sir," said Bob timidly. "I shall have to pay you a whole day's wages for no work." "It's only once a year, sir," said Bob. "And that's once too often," growled Scrooge. But he knew he had to let the clerk go. "Just be sure to come earlier the following day to make up for it," he barked. As Bob left, Bob ran off like a lad let out of school. He slid down a frozen hill 20 times at the end of a line of boys. Then he hurried home to play blind man's buff with his family. Scrooge ate a lonely supper in a miserable inn and read the financial papers. Marley's ghost. Scrooge lived alone in rooms in a gloomy old house that had belonged to Jacob Marley. He was putting his key in the door when he noticed the big old-fashioned knocker. There was something different about it tonight. It was Marley's face. Marley's face was a dismal shade of green. Ghostly spectacles were perched on its forehead, and its hair moved gently, as if a breeze were stirring it. As Scrooge stared, it turned back into a knocker again. Scrooge was not frightened. He did not believe in ghosts. He entered the house, lit his candle, and went up the wide staircase. He told himself firmly that Marley had been dead for 7 years. Upstairs, everything was as usual. A saucepan of porridge was on the hob by a small coal fire. Scrooge put on his slippers, dressing gown, and nightcap, and sat down to eat his porridge. But first he made sure the door was locked. There were pictures of Bible characters on the tiles around the fireplace. To Scrooge, they all bore the eerie look of Jacob Marley. "Humbug," said Scrooge. Just then, a bell high above the fireplace began to swing to and fro. It had not been used for years, but now it began to ring loudly. Then came a clanking noise deep in the house, as if someone were dragging a heavy chain up from the cellar. "Humbug," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." But the cellar door opened and the noise came up the stairs and into the room. The flame in the fire leapt up, as if to cry out in alarm, "I know him! Marley's ghost!" And there was Marley, wearing his usual waistcoat and tight trousers. A chain was wound round his waist, made of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, account books, and metal purses. Scrooge could see right through Marley's body to the buttons on the back of his coat. "You don't believe in me, do you?" said the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "You could be the result of an upset stomach. Perhaps you were a crumb of cheese or an undigested bit of beef." The ghost took no notice of Scrooge's feeble joke. Instead, it gave a frightful cry and rattled its chain. "I made this chain in life, link by link and yard by yard," it said. "You have one too, just as heavy as mine, but you have had 7 years more, so yours is much longer." Scrooge looked down, but saw nothing. "I only thought about money. I lost so many chances to do good," sighed the ghost. "But you were a good businessman, Jacob." "Business! Human beings were my business. I neglected them, and this is my punishment." "Why have you come to me?" asked Scrooge. "To warn you, so that you can escape my fate. You will be visited by 3 spirits. The first will come to you as the church clock strikes 1. And then the ghost wrapped its chain round its arm and walked backwards towards the window, which opened wide. The ghost floated out in the night air. Scrooge heard sad cries and saw that the sky was full of figures like Marley. They were crying out and trying to reach the suffering human beings they had not helped while they were alive. Suddenly Scrooge felt very tired. He crept into bed and fell asleep right away. The spirit of Christmas passed. Scrooge woke up with a start when the church bell chimed midnight. Was the spirit really going to appear to him at 1 o'clock? He lay awake and listened. At last the bell boomed out 1. The lights all flashed on in his room, and the curtains on his 4-poster bed were drawn back. There stood a strange small figure, with the smooth tender face of a child, but with long white hair like an old man's. It wore a white tunic, and held a branch of holly in its hand. A bright clear light shone from the top of its head. It wore a cap like candle snuffer, which it could use to put out its light. "Who or what are you?" asked Scrooge. "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" "No, your past." "What brings you here?" "To remind you," said the spirit, "to help you. Get up and come with me." Scrooge got out of bed in his nightclothes and took the spirit's hand. They were suddenly in a small town in the country. Boys were riding along the road, some on ponies, some in farmers' carts, calling to one another happily. They were going home for the Christmas holidays. Scrooge knew who they were, his old school friends. He began to cry. He remembered how he had been left behind that Christmas in a cold, gloomy schoolroom, forgotten by everyone. He saw himself as a boy, reading quietly. Behind him, outside the window, the people in the book came to life. "There's Robinson Crusoe with his parrot, and Ben Friday running along the beach," Scrooge called out excitedly. But the pictures faded. He dried his eyes on his sleeve. "I wish," he said. "What?" asked the ghost. "There was a boy singing carols outside my office tonight," said Scrooge. "I wish I had given him something." The spirit waved its hand. "Let's look at another Christmas." It was the same classroom. The boy was older, alone again. Suddenly the door opened and a little girl rushed in and hugged him. It was his sister. She had been sent to bring him home for Christmas. "She was never strong. She died young," said Scrooge. "And left behind one child, I believe," said the spirit. "Your nephew?" "Yes," said Scrooge thoughtfully. Then they left the school behind and found themselves in a huge city. It was Christmas Eve and the streets were lit up. They stopped at a warehouse door. "Do you know it?" asked the spirit. "Know it? I was apprenticed here," said Scrooge excitedly. There was a jolly party in full swing. Old Fezziwig, Scrooge's employer, was celebrating with his family and workers. There was a splendid supper, cold meats, mince pies, cake and beer. Best of all, there was a fiddler who played lively music for country dancing. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig were the top couple in the games. Old Fezziwig seemed to be everywhere at once, and Mrs. Fezziwig kept up with him. Scrooge was delighted. He enjoyed it all as much as he had all those years ago. At the end he looked up at the spirit. "Is anything the matter?" asked the spirit. "No," said Scrooge. "I just wish I have said something nice to my clerk. That's all." The next picture was not so cheerful. Scrooge was older and looked meaner. He was talking to his sweetheart. She was saying that he cared more about money than about her, and she gave him back his engagement ring. Next he saw his sweetheart happily married to someone else, while he sat alone in his office. "Take me away!" he cried out. He struggled with the spirit, trying to press the cap down on the light of memory that shone from its head. Suddenly he was in his own bedroom. He fell on his bed and sank into a deep slumber. The spirit of Christmas present. Scrooge woke up again with a jump. Just as the clock was striking, a blaze of light shone in the next room. He heard a voice calling him. Scrooge put on his slippers and shuffled to the door. He was astonished to see that the room was decorated with holly, ivy, and mistletoe, and there was a huge fire in the grate, heaped up on the floor to make a kind of throne. There were roast turkeys, geese, joints of beef, sausages, mince pies, Christmas puddings, and pyramids of fruit. On top of the heap sat a jolly giant, holding a torch shaped like a horn of plenty. "Come in, man, and get to know me," said the giant. "I'm the ghost of Christmas present." The spirit was dressed in a deep green robe, edged with white fur, and wore a holly wreath on his brown curly hair. "I know you have come to do me good," said Scrooge humbly. "Please take me with you and show me your message." The spirit took him out into the streets, where people were doing their last-minute Christmas shopping. Church bells rang out. Poor people, who could not afford the fool to cook at home, were carrying their dinners to the baker's shop. The spirit sprinkled a few drops of his torch in blessing on the poor folks' dinners. They came to a very small house. It belonged to Bob Cratchit, Scrooge's clerk. The spirit gave this house a special blessing. The Cratchits were all dressed up in honor of Christmas. Mrs. Cratchit and her daughters had shabby dresses, but they had decked them out with bright ribbons. Young Peter was sticking a fork into the bubbling saucepan of potatoes, while one of the girls laid the table. "Here, come Father and Tiny Tim!" cried the children, as Bob, with Tiny Tim on his shoulder, came through the door. Tiny Tim carried a crutch and had an iron frame on his leg. Just then 2 young Cratchits came charging in from the baker's, bringing the goose on a tray. Mrs. Cratchit heated up the gravy. Peter mashed the potatoes, the girls dished up the apple sauce and put out the warm plates. Everyone sat around the table, and Bob said grace. They all said there never was such tender, tasty goose, and there was enough for everyone. Next it was the turn for Christmas pudding, which had been boiling away in the kitchen copper. Mrs. Cratchit carried it in, glazing with brandy and with a sprig of holly on top. No one even dared to hint that it was rather a small pudding for such a big family. At last they all sat around the fire, eating roast chestnuts and drinking Christmas toasts. "I wish a Merry Christmas to all of us, my dear," said Bob. "God bless us." "God bless us, everyone," added Tiny Tim. He sat beside his father, who held his thin little hand. "Spirit," whispered Scrooge, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see an empty chair," said the spirit, "and beside it a little crutch. If these shadows do not change, Tiny Tim will not see another Christmas." "But why should you care? Let him die. There are too many poor people." Hearing his own words, Scrooge was silent with shame. Then the spirit showed Scrooge what Christmas meant to people in lonely, faraway places, to miners below the earth, to men in lighthouses surrounded by sea and storm, to sailors on board ship in the dark night, singing carols as they worked. Suddenly Scrooge heard a jolly laugh. It was Fred, his nephew. He was having a Christmas party, and they were playing a guessing game. Fred had to think of something, and could only answer yes or no questions about it. Yes, he was thinking of an animal. A savage, disagreeable animal. Yes, it lived in London. No, it was not in a zoo. No, it was not a horse, or a donkey, or a tiger, or a cat, or a bear. Fred laughed so much he almost fell off the sofa. At last his plump sister-in-law squealed out, "I know who it is. It's your Uncle Scrooge." And so it was. They all drank a toast to Uncle Scrooge. Who would have answered them? But the spirit took him away again. Gradually the spirit grew smaller and smaller. His brown hair turned into grey. "Is your life so short?" asked Scrooge. "Yes, it ends at midnight." Then Scrooge noticed something hiding in the folds of the spirit's robe. There were 2 children sheltering there, a boy and a girl, very thin, half-starved, and ragged. "These are the children of the world who have no parents, and no one to make a Christmas for them," said the spirit sadly. "Have they nowhere to go?" asked Scrooge. "Are there no prisons?" said the spirit, turning on him with his own words. "Are there no workhouses?" The clock struck 12. Scrooge looked about for the spirit, but it was gone. Instead he saw a solemn figure, clad in a dark hood and cloak, gliding like a mist over the ground towards him. It was the last of the spirits, the spirit of Christmas yet to come. The spirit did not speak. All Scrooge could see of it in the gloom was one outstretched hand, pointing from its black garment. Scrooge was filled with fear. "Are you the spirit of the future?" he asked, trembling. "Are you going to show me things that are going to happen in years to come?" The spirit seemed to bend its head. "Will you not speak to me?" The spirit only pointed straight ahead. They were in the city. Businessmen were standing in groups, chinking the coins in their pockets. Scrooge and the spirit stopped near enough to hear what some of them were saying. "I don't know much about it," said one fat merchant. "I only know that he's dead." "Who has he left all his money to?" asked another. "I don't know. He hasn't left it to me." They all laughed. "I wonder who'll go to his funeral," said the fat man. He hadn't any friends. Scrooge wondered who they were talking about. He looked about for himself, but he was not in his usual place of business. Next the spirit took Scrooge to a dreadful slum in the poorest part of London. Under a low roof there stood a shabby old second-hand shop, full of rubbish. A rag-and-bone man crouched by an evil-smelling stove, waiting for customers. Two men and women came out of the murky night carrying bundles. They had some bedding, clothes, and old curtains to sell. "Where did you get these, then?" croaked the rag-and-bone merchant, picking them over. "The old chap we took them from won't want them again," chuckled the woman. "If he hadn't been such a wicked old screw, he might have had someone to look after him when he was dying," said one of the men, throwing down a pair of cufflinks. "It serves him right." Scrooge watched as a few coins changed hands. "Spirit," he said, "doesn't anyone feel anything about this man's death?" The ghost spread its dark robe out like a wing, and then drew it back to show a room where her mother sat with her young children. Her husband came in, looking ill and worried, yet there was a look of joy in his face. "We have more time to pay our debt," he said. "Has the old man relented, then?" asked his wife eagerly. "No," said her husband, "he's dead." The wife's face brightened. The only feeling anyone had for the man's death was relief. Scrooge begged the spirit to show him some kind of feeling connected with the death. In reply, the spirit took him to Bob Cratchit's house. The little Cratchits were quiet. Their mother was sewing. "Your father is late tonight," she said. "I think he walks slower in the evening than he did with Tiny Tim on his shoulder," said Pete. "Your father loved Tiny Tim, and he was so light to carry," said their mother. Just then Bob came in, and his family hurried to get his tea. They had been to the cemetery. "It's a lovely place," said Bob. "I promised Tiny Tim we would go there every Sunday." "We must never forget Tiny Tim, and we must never quarrel with one another, for he was so patient and good." They all hugged one another and promised. Scrooge said anxiously to the spirit, "Show me myself as I shall be in years to come." The spirit took him to his office, but another man sat at his desk. Scrooge began to feel a sense of dread. Still pointing, the tall black figure took Scrooge to an iron gate that led to a neglected churchyard, where the grass and the nettles had grown high. The spirit stood among the graves and, with its long finger, pointed to one. "Before I look at that grave," said Scrooge, "tell me, spirit, are these things that will happen, or are they things that may happen?" The spirit just continued to point at the grave without speaking. Scrooge crept towards it, and trembling read, "Ebenezer Scrooge." "No, no," cried Scrooge, clutching the spirit's robe. "I'm not that man. I will not be that man. Isn't there any hope for me? Can I not change what you have shown?" The spirit's hand trembled. "I promise to keep Christmas in all my heart. I promise to remember the lessons the spirit have taught me. Christmas past, Christmas present, and Christmas future. Please tell me I can change the writing on the stone." As he begged the spirit, he saw an alteration in its hood and dress. It shrank, collapsed, and changed into a bedpost. "God bless us, everyone!" It was Scrooge's own bedpost, and his own room, and it was his own time ahead to make up for the past. He scrambled out of the bed and clutched the bed curtains. They had not been torn down and sold. He put on his clothes, inside out, upside down, anyway, laughing and crying at the same time. "A Merry Christmas, everybody!" he shouted. A Happy New Year to the world! He heard the church bells ringing out. Clash, clash, hammer, ding dong. The fog had cleared, and there was a golden sunlight and fresh morning air. Scrooge flung open the window. "What day is it?" he called to a boy in the street. "What day? Why, Christmas Day!" Scrooge had not lost any time after all. The spirits had shown him all their wonders in one night, and it was still Christmas morning. "Do you know the butcher's in the next street?" Scrooge called down to the boy. "Of course," replied the boy. "Go and tell the butcher I want the biggest turkey in the shop, the prize turkey. Bring the man back with you so that I can tell him where to take it, and I will give you half-a-crown." The boy ran off down the street and came back with a splendid turkey. "I will send it to Bob Cratchit," chuckled Scrooge. "He won't know where it came from. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim." After he had sent the man off with the turkey, he had a good look at the door knocker. "What an honest expression it has! It's a wonderful knocker," he said, stepping back inside. Scrooge shaved, dressed up in his best suit, and went out. He smiled at all people he met and wished them a Merry Christmas, and they returned the greeting. Then he spotted one of the gentlemen who had been collecting for the poor, who went up and whispered something in his ear. The gentleman looked amazed and delighted. "A great many back payments are included in that," said Scrooge. Next he marched boldly up to his nephew's front door and rang the bell. "It's your Uncle Scrooge," he said. "I have come to have dinner. Will you let me in, Fred?" Of course he would. Fred nearly shook Scrooge's hand off. They had the most wonderful dinner party, and Scrooge joined in all, games, dancing, and carol singing. Next morning Scrooge was up early. He wanted to catch Bob Cratchit coming late to the office. Sure enough, poor Bob tried to sneak in unnoticed, nearly 20 minutes after his usual time. He got rid of his hat and comforter, and jumped on his stool, writing away as if his life depended on it. Scrooge growled at him, pretending to be his old horrible self. "What do you mean by coming in at this time of the day?" he snapped. "I'm very sorry," said Bob timidly. "It's only once a year." "I'm not going to stand this sort of thing any longer," said Scrooge, giving Bob a dig in the waistcoat, and therefore giving him another dig, which pushed him right back into the outer office. "Therefore I am about to raise your wages." Bob thought Scrooge had gone mad. He looked about for the ruler in case he needed to defend himself. "A Merry Christmas, Bob," said Scrooge. "A merrier Christmas than I have given you for many a year, my poor fellow. Make up the fire, let's have a real blaze, and fetch another bucket of coal. I will look after your family and help Tiny Tim, and we'll brew up a hot toddy this afternoon to celebrate." Scrooge was better than his word. He did all that he said and more, and to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. Scrooge became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city of London knew, or any city in the good old world. He saw no more spirits, but it was said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas as well as any man alive. May that be true for all of us, and as Tiny Tim once said, God bless us, everyone.